Hey, pushers. So just some fair warning. Today is going to be a long one because we're going to be looking at the Cold War culture going from the 1950s all the way up until the 1960s. Something else that I do want to let you know about is that anytime you see one of these little guys, the little like YouTube play symbol, that is going to be a little note to you that there is a video that is linked along with it. These are all supplementary, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of insight as to what each of them are. But for the first time, we have a lot of video that is available, and a lot of this really helps us understand more about the 1950s and also the early 1960s because movies and television were such a huge part of the era. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start off with the presidents of the 1950s. So that's going to be Truman and Eisenhower. And Truman had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." And that was his way of letting the public know and letting everybody that went into the Oval Office know that any and all decisions ended with him. So anything that went right and also anything that went wrong ended with him. So first thing we look at here are some changes for our GI Joes, or rather our returning GIs from World War II. And the first big change that we're going to see happens in 1944, which is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. And this really broad bill is going to provide a lot of different benefits for returning World War II veterans, including low-cost mortgages and loans, college or vocational education tuition, and also unemployment compensation. So this was a really important piece of legislation because it was a lot better than what our World War I veterans had gotten, but also that it was helping to ensure that our World War II veterans came back to the United States with the ability to be productive members of society, that they were able to buy their own home, to get a college education that will make them more useful in our society economically. The other thing that's going to happen for our returning GIs is Executive Order 9981. And this executive order by the president under Truman abolished racial discrimination in the armed forces, which eventually leads to desegregation of the armed forces. So from this point forward, we will no longer have separate fighting forces for people of color, but rather that we will have an integrated force. And this was done so that we could show our enemies, specifically the communists, that we are a united front against communism, that we are not divided. It makes us look stronger overall. So Harry S. Truman, having to take over for FDR, is going to try and continue on many of the programs and many of the ideals that FDR had instituted under the New Deal. And so Truman is going to call his the Fair Deal. And he calls it this because he says every segment of our population and every individual has a right to expect from his government a fair deal. This was said in his State of the Union address. And his plan was focusing on a very wide variety of projects and programs, including things like civil rights and welfare, education, housing, etc. Now we see a massive list of things here that he was looking to accomplish. However, not all of them are actually going to pass during Truman's administration. In fact, only these three passed during his administration. He increases public housing, which are called federal housing projects, which if you've ever heard in a music or television or movie where they've talked about the projects, that's what they're talking about. The other thing that is going to occur is the increase of the minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents an hour. And there was huge controversy over this. Now, by today's standards, 75 cents an hour is a joke because you guys are up to what, $11 an hour now? But back in that time, that was seen as extremely radical, and they were afraid that that was going to lead to mass inflation and it was going to lead to mass unemployment because companies wouldn't be able to keep up with it. What actually ended up happening? It actually helped, and that more people were being employed, more people had enough money to get by, and it actually led to people being able to have some excess income, some disposable income. The final of these was expanding Social Security coverage to include single mothers. Now, the reason that this is going to be included during this period of time, as you might guess, is because of World War II. So many women had been widowed during the war, and it was very difficult for women to get jobs that were going to pay enough that they would be able to survive on their own. So that's why Social Security was expanded to help them. Now, we are going to see a few more of these be passed later on. All of these that are in red are going to be passed through other presidencies, both Kennedy, Eisenhower, as well as Johnson's administration. So we're going to see some more money going to education, more tax cuts for low-income earners, as well as the creation of a Department of Welfare that will extend the ideals of Social Security to people who are not quite eligible under regular Social Security. Now, of the ones that are remaining, another one is going to be passed, and that is going to be universal health insurance. However, this does not pass until 2010 under President Obama. So the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, is not a new idea. It was not an idea that he came up with, but rather it was something that had started all the way back under Truman. And it was actually an idea that was supported at different times by both political parties. So even though Truman was eligible for another term, he chose not to because in reality, he just wasn't popular enough to get reelected. The Korean War had really thrown a wrench into his popularity. And we're going to see an open election. That means that both sides are putting up brand new people. And the Republicans are going to be making a shift in their outlook. So they're going to be becoming even more like the Republican Party that we're familiar with today. We're going to see more of that shifting over. So what the new Republicanism from the 1950s looks like? Well, it's still a lot like the 1920s and their ideas on economics, laissez-faire, and big business. However, they are going to take a very strong anti-communist stance, as well as that they are going to look to cut social programs, many of which had been created under Truman and FDR. Why they wanted to do this is because they felt that money could be better spent in fighting the communists. And the person that is going to really embody a lot of this sentiment is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we remember is the commanding general of the Allied forces during D-Day and much of World War II. Now, President Eisenhower is going to win his election in 1952 and then will be reelected in 1956. Also, just as a little note to you, Eisenhower's longtime nickname had always been Ike. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, if you see Ike, that's who it's referring to. So how did he end up winning? This is a guy who has absolutely no political experience, no governing experience, and really initially had no intention of running. It was very much a grassroots campaign. Average people said, we want you to run. We want your leadership. We think you will take the hard stance against communism that we are looking for. And so this grassroots kind of coming up from the bottom campaign was made very successful because he used something that no other president had done before, and that was to utilize television and utilize ads. And so the recording button that you see on Ike's picture actually takes you to one of his ads, which is extremely catchy. It's very fun and was very successful in getting his name out there and getting people to want to vote for him. Once he was in office, he very swiftly ended the Korean War, and that made him that much more successful and more popular, so that it was a really easy way for him to win in 1956. Now, who did he bring in as his vice president? That's going to be the guy at the bottom, and that is California Senator Richard Nixon. Now, the reason that he likes Nixon is because Nixon is he's already had a lot of governing experience by this point. He's already been in government for like 20 plus years. He knows how it works, so he's got the experience that Eisenhower doesn't. The other thing that is going to make him a really great running mate is that Nixon has already made a name for himself as a very strong commie hunter, and so that is going to be a really good pairing. However, unfortunately, Nixon already has some skeletons in his closet. He's got some things that make people less interested in wanting to vote for them. And it comes down to actually there being a suggestion that Nixon had actually misused campaign funds, that he had actually embezzled campaign funds for his own private interests. Now, opposed to what Eisenhower wanted, Nixon decides that he's going to go on television to tell the American public his side of the story, to explain to them his ideas and his side of the story, and to try and clear his name. However, what he ends up doing is when he gets on screen, he goes through and says, you know, he hadn't misused the funds and all of these things, but then he kind of shifts the perspective. And then he says, now, if there's one thing, one of these gifts, one of these things that I have been given in the course of this campaign that I refuse to give up, it is a darling little Cocker Spaniel puppy that my children have named Checkers, and they love Checkers dearly. I love Checkers dearly, and I refuse to give Checkers up. And so now the entire attention and the entire takeaway from his televised speech was not what had happened to the money and was he misusing these campaign funds. Everybody was saying, I can't believe anybody would try and take away that sweet little puppy from his children. And so this becomes infamously known as the Checkers speech, which is linked onto the video right next to his picture. So when we're describing the 1950s, many times it'll be referred to as the Affluent Society. And the word affluent means to have a lot of money. And so it means that we as a society during this period of time have a lot of money. And there's a lot of things that kind of go together with that. And so we're going to explore these various elements that not only make us affluent, but also support that affluence. So the first of these is looking at what is the new normalcy, the new normal of the post-World War II era. And conformity is the new normal. Everybody is going to try and look and act and behave the same. The reason for this is because it is a reaction to the upheaval of World War II. If everybody is now acting the same, looking the same, having the same goals, etc., it allows us to feel like things are more solid, that things are less controversial, that things are less frightening or even less dangerous. And it also has a lot to do with the fears of communist infiltration. We are afraid that we are going to be allowing communism to sneak its way into the United States. So if everybody looks the same, acts the same, dresses the same, has the same goals, then anyone who is different must not belong. And that is going to hopefully allow for us to remove those dangerous individuals from our society. So really it comes down to the idea that conformity equals unity, that we are a unified country, that we all have the same goals and the same ideals, and that will make us a much more safe society. There's also new ideas when it comes to the American dream, and this is really where the American dream of today is going to be born from. The American dream of the 1950s is pretty much what you see in the picture right here. It's the little house in the suburbs with the white picket fence, husband and wife and the 2 kids, the dog in the yard, the Buick in the driveway. It's that very picture perfect suburban family and suburban ideal. And that is the true new American dream. You want not just enough to get by, but you want a little bit more so that you can live with a little bit of freedom with that excess disposable income. This is going to be centered on the nuclear family. Now, the nuclear family gets its name for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the 1950s and we have this weird obsession with anything and everything that is atomic or nuclear or space oriented. So that's kind of where it comes from. But also, if you think of an atom, the nucleus is the core of the atom. It is what makes up the identity of the atom. So this core family, this married couple with their biological children is the core of the American society, that they are what makes not only the identity of America, but also that they are what is going to make America strong. However, although this is the ideal, it is not necessarily the reality. For example, we have still lots of people who do get divorced. Now, it's definitely not anywhere near to what we have today, but having a mixed family where there are divorced parents, single parents, that still happened, but it was definitely not the ideal. And so what would happen in these types of situations, it was easier for a kid to say that dad died in the war than to have to explain that mom and dad split up. Now, when it comes to this affluent society and what makes us affluent, we do have this general wealth that follows World War II. And part of the reason is that our income is going to jump dramatically. Because of the mass production that had occurred during World War II, our economy was rolling strong as the war was going. Plus, we were then, once the war was over, able to take many of those technologies and many of those skills and turn them into new consumer products that were very efficient, they were very desirable, and so it kept people not only employed, but it also kept the economy high because everybody wanted to buy these new products. We'll talk, for example, about the obsession with cars a little bit later on, and how this obsession with automobiles is going to lead to there being this great affluence. Another thing, the GI Bill allows for there to be greater home ownership. One of the big indicators of a country's wealth has to do with how many people own homes versus how many people rent their homes. And so what we will see is that more and more people are going to own their homes during this period of time because of things like the GI Bill. Now, many of those homes are very, very small in comparison to today's homes, as you see in the background there. But even still, it was a good start for these families, especially for these young families, and they could build upon that and build and buy a bigger house later on. The other thing that's going to happen is that the job demographics begin to shift. We start moving from blue-collar manufacturing jobs to much more of the white-collar and the service jobs. So white-collar means any job that you are doing in an office. Anything where a man is expected to be wearing probably a suit to go to work. And a service job is where you are selling a service rather than an actual physical good. So we have things like PR firms, and we have marketing firms, and we have firms that are dealing with business and finance and advertising much, much to a higher degree than we have in previous generations. However, not everybody is affluent. In fact, there is quite a bit of prominence of poverty. Now, this poverty is going to be to the total of over 30 million people in the United States who are living in poverty. And most of those people are going to be minorities, people of color. Most of those people are also going to be living in the inner cities. The city used to be the place of wealth. The city used to be the place of prominence because that's where all the business went down. However, in the 1950s, we're going to see a phenomenon known as white flight, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But white flight is when white families move away from the cities as the demographics start to shift, basically with the browning of the cities, and they move out to the suburbs. When they do that, they take their tax dollars with them. So these more affluent, more wealthy families are moving away from the cities, which means that the only people living in the cities are going to have less and less money, which means that there is less money for fixing roads and sidewalks, building schools. There's going to be less money for welfare programs in the cities for the people that really need it. This is also going to have a lot to do with racial discrimination that is going to occur in the cities, which we'll talk more about in just a little bit. However, there is discrimination in schools, in housing, as well as in hiring. For example, that African Americans only earned about 51% of what the average white person earned. Now, this is not necessarily to say that they were getting the same jobs and earning less, because for the most part, African Americans were not able to get the same jobs as white Americans. However, just in general, the overall income level was about at half. So that gives you just a clearer view as to how prominent this issue of poverty really was in this period of overall affluence. So what makes for this affluence, especially among the white society, that is going to be the changes to the workplace. So these white collar jobs, as I was mentioning, these are jobs where you are expected to wear a business suit, that you are doing more, I guess, intellectual labor rather than physical labor. And this is going to be kind of supported by the expansion of business, especially with chain stores and franchises. So a chain store is a store that has multiple locations, right? So In-N-Out would be a chain store. Forever 21 would be a chain store. There are multiple locations, multiples of this business. They have a central brand and a central management system. They have these standardized business practices. You walk into one Forever 21 and it looks pretty much exactly like every other one that you would find anywhere else in the United States. A franchise is slightly different though. For example, a franchise is also a chain store, but not all chain stores are franchises. So a franchise is where the central brand, the owner of the brand, allows for an operator to rent the brand and open their own chain store location. And they do this for a fee. So this would be like McDonald's. McDonald's is probably the most famous franchise. And especially it's famous because it erupts during this period during the 1950s. So when you go to your local McDonald's, it's not necessarily owned by the same person who owns the McDonald's that's down the street, that they are independently owned and operated, if you've ever heard that phrase before. However, they're owned in the sense of that they have the same ownership on the grand scheme of the corporation. So they're part of this big, broad McDonald's corporation. However, the central McDonald's does not own and operate every single McDonald's. It's up to the person who owns that one single franchise location to make sure that it's successful. However, the nice thing with these chain stores and these franchises is that there's uniformity and there's consistency. And that means for the people that are going across the United States, traveling to various cities, men going on business trips, etc., they know what to expect. They know that when they go into McDonald's, they know that the menu is going to be essentially the same, the food's going to taste essentially the same, the decor is going to be essentially the same. They know what they're getting. It's not going to be, I go into a new city and I don't know where's the good place to go eat. Whatever, I'll just go to Mickey D's. Another thing that's going to be new and different with the 1950s workplace is the introduction of what we call the organization man, or sometimes called the company man. So the company man is a man whose identity and worth is directly linked to his company and its success. So who you are as a person is directly related to how well known your company is, how well respected your company is, and how much money that they bring in. So at this time, yes, men would actually introduce themselves to new people by citing their company. Hi, I'm Bob and I work for GE. And everybody's like, ooh, GE's doing really well. This guy must be doing really well. This guy must be important. I should respect this guy because I respect GE. If you kind of want to see what the organization man or the company man is like, look at any episode of Mad Men and you'll get kind of an idea of what this is like. Now, although this is kind of the standard, that this is the ideal, that men, your self-worth, your worthiness in society was directly related to how successful you were at work, not everybody was actually fulfilled by that. And we see this in a book that was introduced in 1956, and it was so immensely immediately popular that it led to there being a movie that was made just the year next. And that is the movie and book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. And the movie, the title character was played by Gregory Peck, who you might recognize from To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, this story, however, is showing how although this man, is very successful and he has this great job and he has basically everything that he should want, he still feels unfulfilled. And he ends up with an extramarital affair to try and deal with his lack of, feeling worthy. However, it doesn't fulfill him still. And he basically ends up kind of feeling that none of these things are his secret to happiness. As I was saying earlier, one of the things to note about our affluence is going to be this post-war consumerism, that we now have money in order to buy stuff. So why this consumerism arises in the 1950s, very similar to kind of the consumerism we saw in the 1920s. Number one is this post-war affluence. Like I said, we're no longer having to ration, we're no longer having to scrimp and save because of the war effort, but we have this extra money. Our income has tripled. We have money and we want to spend it. And we want to spend it on stuff that makes us happy now, not necessarily saving for the future. Another thing is going to be a practice known as Fordism, which you guys are probably familiar with. You just didn't know it had a name. Fordism is the idea of using the same process as Ford in mass production. So we're seeing the mass production of everything. We're seeing the mass production of refrigerators and washing machines, of automobiles, but we're also seeing it of clothing and other consumer materials. And so everything is now being automated, everything is now being mass produced, and so everything is now cheaper than it ever was before. But there's a new phenomenon that's going to happen during this period, and it's called keeping up with the Joneses. So the idea of keeping up with the Joneses is that everybody wanted to show that they had the same affluence as their neighbors. So if, Bob down the street buys his wife a new washing machine, well, what does that say about me if my husband doesn't buy me a new washing machine? What does that say about my husband and his prominence in his company or the amount of money that we have? So therefore, you see these people who are looking to make extra money, or rather to buy these extra things with their extra money so that they can prove that they are just as eligible and just as valuable to live in this neighborhood as their neighbors are. What does this post-war consumerism look like? Well, one of these, just like the 1920s, is that there's going to be a lot of really easy credit. Credit is not only easy to get at this time, but also we have the very first credit card. So previously, credit was done by keeping tabs in a ledger. Now, you actually have a card that goes along with a company that provides you the extra credit. Now, this Diners Club card was meant for businessmen who were taking clients out for meals and for drinks. And the Diners Club card became so widely popular that suddenly there was an explosion of credit cards. Now, these credit cards were allowing for people to purchase things that were bigger items that they couldn't necessarily afford all in one fell swoop to purchase, but it allowed them to buy it, to enjoy it as they actually paid off the difference. We also have a massive technology boom. The technologies that were derived during World War II are now being applied towards convenience items. Things like toasters and washing machines and vacuum cleaners, those things that make our lives easier. And the other part that goes with this consumerism is print and television advertising. We see a massive, massive influx in advertising during this period of time. The show Mad Men is actually looking at the men who worked on Madison Avenue in New York, which is where all of the advertising agencies were all located at. And they were constantly fighting for who is going to get the ability to make the ads for each of these new companies. And especially the television advertising really became hugely prominent. Everybody now had a television in their home. This is going to be the new method that everybody gets their information and their entertainment. And so television advertising was really, really important. Now, what was great about it is that the characters were phenomenal and the storylines were really kind of intricate and elaborate. And these characters that were in this television advertising and the commercials many times were better produced and more entertaining than the shows that they were interrupting. So as opposed to today where we all try and, flip through all the commercials and try and avoid them, back in the 1950s, people would actually be more willing to leave the show during the actual show than during the commercials because people wanted to watch Speedy Alka-Seltzer and Bucky Beaver from Ipana toothpaste. And so these characters, a lot of them are ones you're familiar with even still today. Ones like Tony the Tiger, Jeffrey Giraffe from Toys R Us, R.I.P. Mr. Clean, you have Lucky from Lucky Charms. So all of these are coming out in the 1950s, and so everybody knows them, and they're household names. Now, one of the most popular ways for people to purchase and kind of spend this affluence and to enjoy this consumerism was with automobiles. And during the 1950s, we see a huge car culture start to emerge. And the reason for this, post-World War II, is number one, materials are no longer being rationed. There were no cars being really made during World War II because we needed those materials to build bombers and tanks and things like that. So now we can build cars again. And because they're no longer rationed, we are going way overboard with them, that they're going to be longer, they're going to be flashier, and we're going to do things that are there solely for cool factor rather than for anything that is for aerodynamics or anything like that. For example, the fins that you see on this car right here, those serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. They just look freaking cool. They kind of make it look like a rocket. And you'll also see at this time a lot of taillights that'll look like bullets. And that's also to make it look like kind of the fire that comes out of the end of a rocket. A convertible serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever except for it looks just really freaking cool. And because everybody has money right now, we can spend that on buying new cars. In fact, during the 1950s, the number of two-car homes is going to double. And that means that dad has a car to drive to work, but that means that mom also has a car where she can go grocery shopping and go to the beauty salon. We're also going to see that they're going to come in a gumball, machine full of colors, that we've got red and pink and yellow and green and baby blue. And we're going to have all these things that are designed around our car. And because of our obsession with these new automobiles, there's now a new desire for driving related businesses, that we have the invention of the drive-through. Because we're so obsessed with our cars, we don't even want to get out of them to go eat, for example. And so we're going to see not only the very first McDonald's open in the 1950s, but also the first McDonald's drive-through, because we want to be able to get our food and go. It's that convenience factor. But also we see ones like you see Sonic today, where you drive up and you have the car hop come out on her roller skates, and she's going to take your order and then bring it out to you, and you're going to eat in your car. It's kind of a fun novelty today, but in the 1950s, that was the way people wanted to spend their time, because they loved their cars that much. Another thing that we're going to see is that people are going to travel more using their automobiles, and they're going to need places to stay that are going to be familiar and be of high enough quality. And so you see these chain and franchised hotels and restaurants across the country for that very reason. So for example, Howard Johnson's, which was both a hotel and a restaurant, had locations all across the nation, so that no matter where you traveled, you knew that there was a safe, relatively clean, though simple and also affordable place to stay, that had a diner that was open 24/7, that had good solid food that was relatively cheap. And so this was going to have more people interested in traveling via car. How were they doing this? They were doing it on Route 66. Route 66 is the main highway thoroughfare that went through the United States, and it reached across 2/3 of the United States, reaching all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles. Because it was the main way to get from east to west or vice versa across the nation, it got the nickname of Main Street USA. It also was known many times as the Mother Road because it birthed so many different communities as well as different roadways off of it. It was the main way that people came to the United States, came to California from the Dust Bowl, as well as that it was going to support economies all along the road. That because this was the main way that people traveled from east to west, that the cities that were along Route 66 really relied on that road travel to survive. So, for example, we're going to see all kinds of weird little stopping places, all of these quirky little shops and novelties along the way. For example, in Catoosa, Oklahoma, a man wanted to convince people to stop in his town, so he built this big whale water slide that went into a lake that was in his front yard, and it got people to stop and to stay in that city. Out in Amarillo, Texas, that you had all of these weird psychedelic painted cars that were all in a row and buried into the ground. And then Flagstaff, Arizona had not one, not two, but three really big draws. There was the giant Paul Bunyan. There were the two arrows, giant arrows that were stuck into the ground that was for a hotel. And then the third one that you see up at the top there, which is known as the Wigwam Motel, where you could stay in a hotel room that looked like its own little teepee. Now, a lot of these cities are going to be described in a song called Route 66, which was linked onto the previous page. And a lot of these you're looking at, you might be thinking, man, those look familiar. And if you're thinking to yourself, man, those remind me a lot of things that I saw in the movie Cars, well, you wouldn't be wrong. The movie Cars is very much taken from the 1950s and from the Route 60, the cities along Route 66. And so the cars that you see there, they're all kind of stuck from the 1940s and 50s. So for example, Mater is supposed to be a 1951 International Harvester, while Ramon is a 1959 Chevy Impala lowrider. And so you can see here the actual real life cars that they're designed to look like. And the movie does a really great job of explaining what happened to those cars when the interstate came through. Now, the interstate was very important. It was designed under Eisenhower to ensure that we had safe and efficient travel, especially for our military in times of trouble and military issues, but also that it was going to allow for, faster travel across the United States for trucks and consumers. And so that was going to, improve our economy. However, what we see from the movie is that a lot of those cities that were along Route 66 ended up dying off because there wasn't that travel in order to sustain them. So now we moved into Cold War society and how we as a culture interact with each other, as well as the roles of each person within the new American family. And a lot of this is going to have to do with the suburban household. So let's talk about suburbia. So during the 1950s, we're going to see a massive surge in the marriage rate as well as the birth rate. And we'll talk more about the birth rate in just a little bit. But we're going to see that those two things, so the number of people getting married plus the number of people having babies, is going to surge. That paired with the GI Bill and the benefits, especially with the low interest rate mortgages, is going to lead to a lot of people wanting houses, but there's not enough of them to actually go around. At this time, for the most part, houses are being built kind of on a one-by-one basis, and so there's just not enough for the people that actually want them or can afford them. Until, ladies and gentlemen, we get Levittown, which you see in the background picture here. Levittown was the very first mass-produced housing tract. So very much like the housing tract that you live in is going to be just like these. And so this is kind of the first one. So in this home, these houses cost roughly about $8,000, which is not a ton of money even back then. Inflated to today's cost, that would be roughly about $85,000, which is about $250,000 less than the average price in our area, or rather $350,000 less. Excuse me. With this period and with like the GI Bill, prior to World War II, you would have to put half of the money down and then you would have 10 years to pay off the rest. That's a lot of money for people to have to save up. And it was very difficult for people to do this. So not a lot of people owned their home. But post World War II and with the GI Bill, the new trend was that you had to put only 5% of the cost of the home down as your down payment, and then you had 30 years to pay off the rest. And if you were a veteran, it cost only $1 down. So you had a lot more freedom to get a brand new home. Now, these Levittown homes were standardized, completely standardized. Basically, everything that you needed for it came in on a truck, got dropped off, and they built it rapid fire. Kind of almost think of it like IKEA home, that all the parts are kind of somewhat pre-prepared, kind of prefabricated, and so they could just put, tab A into slot B, and bada bing, you've got yourself a house. In fact, they were able to produce 150 houses per week, which comes out to roughly putting together the framing of a house in under 15 minutes, which is completely amazing. The model of the homes were all standardized, and that meant that they were very simple, but that made it easier for them to put them together. The housing tract was also much more efficient than anything that came before it. If you notice at the map here of Levittown, there are no four-way stops. Why? Because no one knows what to do at a four-way stop. Everybody gets there and nobody knows whose turn it is, and so they kind of get stuck there. But with T intersections, everybody knows who has the right of way. The other thing with it is that that they had a very strict set of guidelines in order to keep the property values high. So you weren't allowed to repaint your house. You weren't allowed to do anything extreme to your landscaping. It was basically kind of the first homeowners association. And so there were some really strict guidelines. One of those guidelines, however, was that it was whites only. And the reason for this, according to Levitt, was that people did not want to buy a home that was either previously owned by a black family or that they would have to live next door to one, because that was going to lower the overall value of their homes. And so it was just not allowed. However, this was then taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled it, saying, sorry, dude, that's not allowed because it goes against the 14th Amendment of, equal access under the law for all citizens. Well, even though it was struck down by the Supreme Court, it still remained an informal tradition. And the first family to move into Levittown in its first tract faced severe discrimination and actually ended up having almost a full-blown riot right in their own community, that there were horrible signs posted, that there was people who were, threatening them. There was even a cross that was burned in their front yard. So it was very difficult for those first few African-American families that wanted to move into the suburbs to actually do so. Because even if they had the money to move into a middle-class neighborhood out in the suburbs, in many cases it just wasn't safe for them to do so. Now, the Levittown homes became kind of an icon for 1950s living. All 6 models that you had to choose from had the same kind of design concepts. It was an open floor plan with minimum interior walls, had big picture windows for natural light. There was also a modern kitchen that came with a fully colored kitchen. So you could get it in all kinds of colors. You could get a blue kitchen or a green kitchen or a yellow kitchen or a pink kitchen. And that was seen to be very kind of highly advanced for the time. It was very sought after for a lot of people. As well as that it had kind of this, this setup where you could have a lot of activities outdoors. Now, as time goes on, they are going to add on things onto these very small homes. So the very first homes were only about 1,000 square feet. They were teeny, teeny, tiny when you can compare them to the size of the houses kind of out in our area that are 3,000-4,000 square feet. So these are teeny, teeny, tiny. As time would go on, they would expand. They would add on, for example, an attached garage and things like that. But the Levittown homes were always designed to be very affordable. However, it also was very cookie cutter. All the houses looked exactly the same. The streets had nearly identical names, and people did actually get lost trying to find their own home because there was nothing to differentiate them. And it also seems that everybody that lived in these areas all acted the same and all behaved the same with that 1950s conformity. So the clip that you see linked on this page links to a song called Little Boxes, and it's a song that was critiquing the 1950s Levittown homes and the suburbs of this era. However, like I said, not everybody was able to actually live within the suburbs, and this was done largely due to a practice known as redlining. Redlining relegated minorities to living in inner city ghettos, making it virtually impossible for them to get out of these areas that were run down and unsafe, even if they had the money to do so. And that's because they were being denied banking services as well as the financial services to get a mortgage. The suburbs were highly segregated, and you see this also extended to things like denying residents options for retail businesses, like they don't have access to supermarkets, or that it would be really, really, really far away for them to go to the hairdresser or something like this. And so it basically forced African Americans to live in very tightly compacted, very, very poor neighborhoods within the inner cities. And as you can see from the signs here, there were also a lot of situations where was made very clear that these tracts were exclusive and restricted to whites only. And so this is part of the reason why when you look at the 1950s suburbs, they are so incredibly, severely white. One other demographic shift that we see at this time is the popularity of what we call the Sun Belt. We see a major population increase in the area of the South and West. Now, why it's called the Sun Belt is because in this area of the South and West, that's where it's sunny most of the time. They have mild winters, they have a lot of sunshine. It's a pleasant place to live. And so we see industries during World War II start to develop in these areas because they don't have to shut down because of a snowstorm, that they can continue operating at all times. So we see a lot of aerospace and defense and also oil booming in the Sun Belt. It also has things that are beneficial to other businesses. For example, because of the warm winters, it reduced heating costs. Because of air conditioning, the summers were livable. That you had a lot of non-union workers in this area, which made it cheaper for you to operate. And so all of these things allowed for the expansion of the Sun Belt. It was also made easier to get to because of the interstate highways. Now, the effects of this, though, number one big shift is electoral shifts. Now, for the first time, we start to see the electoral power shifting away from New England and starting to move into these Sun Belt regions. It is during this period of time that California becomes the most populous state in the nation and would never stop being the most populous state in the nation. And when that happens, that means that other states that had had a lot of power, ones like Iowa and Ohio and Illinois, are actually going to lose electoral votes, and they are going to become less powerful. There's also an issue, though, of things like water scarcity, as well as increased pollution with the increased number of people here. And so that was going to lead to environmental issues that we will look more at later on in this unit. So now we move on to the 1950s family and how we interact with each other as a family unit during this period. And when it comes to love and marriage, we're going to see Americans reverting back to traditional gender roles. So we're going to see men being the breadwinners of the family, the head of the household, and we're going to see women as the homemakers and the child rearers, and kind of reverting back to the cult of domesticity from back in the 1800s. And these roles are going to be reiterated through television and advertising. That we're going to see, for example, advertisements where women are excited about getting a brand new, pink stove, whereas we're going to see, men being excited about, getting a new wax for their car kind of thing. We have television shows called Father Knows Best. And even the one that you see on the bottom left here, this is Donna Reed, and she was one of the few women that actually was the title character of her own show. And yet, in this show, she is a homemaker, and she basically does everything for the benefit of her family. We also see that there is a lot of what we today would consider sexism in advertising. For example, the one to the far right was talking about a new easy open lid for ketchup. And yes, this is a real live ad that said, "You mean a woman can open it?" We also saw sexism in television ads just as well as print ads, which you see in the other clip that is located here. Now, following World War II, we see the marriage rate begin to soar. Everybody got married immediately following the war, as well as that the marriage age started to drop dramatically. That by the 1950s, the average age for a man to get married was 23, and the average age for a woman was only 20 years old. So this was incredibly young, and had dropped almost 4 years of age from the 1920s when people had been putting off marriage. So we definitely are seeing a shift here. The other thing that we start to see this is that the divorce rate starts to drop, that people are staying married. Now, part of that was due to the ideals of conformity, that everybody kind of wanted to act the same and be the same, and no one wanted to be different. And the other thing that is going to have to do with this is in the 1950s, because of those new gender roles, or maybe that return to traditional gender roles, people are going to do what they can to continue a traditionally, quote unquote, normal family. Now, something else that is going to happen during this time is something called the baby boom. Now, immediately following World War II, at the end of World War II, which was in the summertime of 1945, about 9 months later, there was suddenly a massive influx in the number of babies being born. I'll let you guys do all the math on that, but this baby boom would last from 1946 all the way up until 1964. Now, they are considered to be the largest generation in U.S. history. However, that may actually be surpassed by the modern millennial generation. But during this period of time, this about 20-year period, we see 77 million babies being born. This peaks in 1957. However, just considering 77 million babies in only about 20 years is really incredible. And so when that happens, society itself is going to need to change that. And with each new age that these children are reaching, it is going to cause for new developments in America as these children are going to grow up. And probably one of the most important things to happen for the baby boom was actually a book. And that was the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, written by Dr. Benjamin Spock. Not the Spock from Star Trek. This is an actual real life Dr. Spock. Now, Dr. Spock's baby book, as it was most often referred to, helped these very scared, very young mothers feel more prepared to deal with raising a child. Basically letting them know, you know more about raising a child than you think that you do. It's all common sense. And so these types of books, as well as the new products that were made available, for example, things like disposable diapers and more availability of cribs and child's health care, was going to make it possible for people to survive this massive influx of children. Now, as they get older, we're going to see a new focus on things to entertain young children. And the 50s were a great time to be a kid. As these babies grew into children, there is going to be a new focus on things like education. And so we're going to see a huge influx in the number of schools being built during the 1950s and into the 1960s. That we're going to see an emphasis on child health care, that we're going to see an emphasis on child entertainment. And that is where we see a rise in children's programming. That we see new television shows that are designed specifically for children. Some of these are going to be focused solely on morals and behavior, and also education. So, for example, there was a show called Romper Room that was very popular at the time. And it was literally a classroom for like 5-year-olds, maybe 6-year-olds. So kind of think like Dora the Explorer, where they're trying to teach you things. And the teacher would address the camera and address the class, and then you as the class, even at home, were supposed to respond to what the teacher was saying in the classroom. But we also had programming that was solely for children's entertainment. That we had shows like Howdy Doody, which we see in the top right corner. Howdy Doody was a marionette, and he had his own show, and the audience was made up of entirely young children who sang the intro every single time. And they would start it off with, "Hey kids, do you know what time it is?" And they'd all yell back, "It's Howdy Doody time." And if that sounds weirdly familiar to you, that was played off of by SpongeBob SquarePants. And that's largely because the people that were making the show, as well as the people who were going to be the adults of the children watching the show, the parents of the children watching the show, had grown up during the era of Howdy Doody. Now, the creepy guy you see next to Howdy Doody, that is the very first Ronald McDonald. And he was immediately a popular character. And McDonald's tried to show itself as a family-friendly location where parents could bring their kids. They started putting in playgrounds so that the kids could have somewhere to play while mom and dad finished eating. And they really tried to make it as a family-friendly restaurant location. And then at the bottom left, we see the ears for the Mickey Mouse Club. And I'll talk more about the Mickey Mouse Club in just a little bit and about Disneyland. But the Mickey Mouse Club is going to be introduced in 1955, and it was an instantaneous success among children to watch. Now, the other thing that's going to happen for young kids is going to be a health thing, and that is going to be the polio vaccine. Polio was a disease that mainly affected children. It had affected FDR and was what had caused him to have such weakness in his legs and caused him to be in a wheelchair. Many children were affected by this, and they had to sit in this giant machine that was called an iron lung. And it would basically force them to breathe because their muscles had deteriorated so that they literally did not have the lung power to breathe on their own. And so when he develops this vaccine, he does the most amazing humanitarian thing. He actually gives it to the world for free. He does not patent it. He does not make money off of it. He says, this is going to save the world and America's children. I want everyone to have this. And with only a couple of decades, we had eradicated polio. People do not get it anymore because of this vaccine. Kids got this vaccine in school. You would be in class, you guys would go down to the health office, and a doctor and a school nurse would give out these vaccines to children in the school system. And it was seen as not only the most efficient way for this to happen, but also that it was able to be free because it was going to be paid for through tax dollars. And as we see here, and you don't need to write all these things down, but you can just see all the things that happened during the 1950s that were great for kids. We see the invention of new toys like Silly Putty and Play-Doh and Barbie in 1957. And we're also going to see movies being released like Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz being on television for the first time. And we're going to see new products for children. Things like sugar frosted flakes, McDonald's, and Cocoa Krispies, which when it first came out was 43% sugar. So that's just going to rot your teeth straight out of your head. But it was such a great time to be a kid because there were so many things being produced, especially for you, simply because of your age. Now, as the children that were born during and immediately following World War II grew up during the 1950s, we see a brand new thing, a teenager. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, you as an individual group did not exist prior to the 1950s. The term teenager was first coined in the 1950s as kind of a singularized word to define a specific group of people that had defined interests that were different from people who were older and younger than them. Prior to this, you were just called children in the same way that a 5-year-old would be considered a child. And so being seen as a distinctly different age group was really important. Young people at this time in the teenage group, there were 13 million teens in America by 1956, and you had large amounts of what we call disposable income, lots of extra money that you didn't have to do anything with, that you could just kind of enjoy with whatever way you wanted. So you would spend it by going to the soda shop or buying yourself new clothes, or especially buying yourself records, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. There was also, however, a very strict code of conduct for young people that you were expected to obey authority no matter what, no matter who it was, whether it was your parent or whether it was your teacher. Any and all adults needed to be respected and to be obeyed. That you needed to control your emotions, that you needed to not lash out, no yelling or talking back to your parents. That you were expected to fit in and not stick out, to kind of conform with the rest of the teenage group. And most importantly, you needed to be modest, that you could not think about romance or sex or anything like that. And a lot of these things you actually see which you, in the book that you see at the bottom right, and this was a guide to teenage charm and popularity. Now, Penny's Guide to Teenage Popularity had all kinds of great little nuggets of wisdom, like there should be a 1-month limit on going steady. That way people get used to being able to deal with uncomfortable and awkward situations. Or that you should always make sure that you are presentable and that you always have your hair spotless and clean. That young men should always make sure that they are walking to the outside of the sidewalk in order to ensure that their date's dress doesn't get muddied if, a car comes up and splashes mud upon them, and so on. So these little pieces of guidance for teenagers was really popular. And as I said, one of the main ways that young people were going to be spending their time and especially spending their money was with music. And if you were one of these teenagers who was following the rules, you might be called a clean teen. And clean teens listened to a very specific type of music that became known as bubblegum. And it was called bubblegum because it was, just like bubblegum, sweet and very poppy. The lyrics were very clean. There was nothing offensive or taboo about them. The melodies were light and pleasant, and the singers themselves were also clean and sweet and pleasant and well-mannered. And so you see 4 of the most popular ones here at the time. So you might see the popularity of songs from these, like these various groups, like Doris Day sang Mr. Sandman, and Rosemary Clooney sang Que Sera Sera. There's also the song Shaboom, and these were all very, very nice, very simple, very sweet songs. Nothing remotely dangerous about them. To give you an example, one of the most popular songs of this time was a song titled How much is that doggy in the window? And it's literally a song about a girl who's going on vacation, doesn't want her boyfriend to be lonely, and so she wants to buy him a dog so he has someone to care for while she's gone. And if that makes you want to throw up, you're not alone. There were a lot of teenagers that this kind of music just wasn't for them, and we'll get to them in just a moment. So as I've already kind of pointed out, there are a number of people who this whole conformity thing, it just didn't work for them. And so we're going to be looking at how this conformity is going to lead to conflict. And the first one that we see is for women. So the woman you see here on the left-hand side, that is Betty Friedan, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. She had gone and interviewed her former college classmates. She had gone to college, gotten her degree, become a journalist, and she was at her reunion and she started to interview them. And what she was noticing from their responses was that although a lot of these women had, gotten a degree from a very well-established college, they had immediately gotten married, had children, and they were a housewife. And although they had, the brand new kitchen, living in the suburbs, and they had this life that they should have been thrilled with, in reality, they just weren't. And so she ended up taking these interviews and putting them in this book, The Feminine Mystique, and she described it as the problem that has no name, that housewives were feeling unfulfilled, that society was telling them they should be content with, the house and the white picket fence, but in reality they felt like, was this everything? Was this as much as that they could achieve? And this is a short excerpt from it. She says, "The suburban housewife was the dream image of the young American woman. She was healthy, beautiful, educated, concerned only about her husband, her children, and her home." She goes on to say, "Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she made beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was often afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" And so what we see is that women were feeling like they were constrained by this being their only option. This was not to say that women thought that it was bad to be a housewife, but rather that there were no real other options. And this has to be a stark contrast for a lot of them, considering that many of them had either worked in the war industry during World War II, or they had at least seen their mothers do that and see the fulfillment that they had received from working outside the home. And that had at least been an option for them. And that was no longer an option for these women. The clip you see linked here is to a movie called Mona Lisa's Smile that talks about also one of the issues facing these women, and that was how advertising was telling women that this was the only option for them. Now, just letting you know, things are going to get a little awkward for a moment because your teacher's going to have to talk about sexy stuff. So in the 1950s, we do see the very beginning of what will be known as the sexual revolution. And this begins in 1953 with a series of reports. It's 2 reports put together by a sociologist by the name of Kinsey. And Dr. Kinsey, in his book, is going to discuss a lot of taboo subjects surrounding sexuality for both men and women. What this essentially showed was that sexuality was a lot more complex than was shown. For example, television shows were not allowed to show a couple, even a married couple, in bed together. The first show that would do that would be I Love Lucy, and that would not happen until the very late 1950s. We also had this time where, extramarital affairs and extramarital sex. So for example, having sex before you were married was seen as such a taboo that anyone who did it in a movie usually ended up dying. So it was a way to try and tell people, like, this is the worst thing you could possibly do. Don't do it because it is morally just wrong. Well, what the Kinsey report showed was that actually nearly half of adult men had had an extramarital affair, that almost a third of married women had had an extramarital affair or had had sex before marriage. So basically what advertising and movies and television was telling us was not actually really accurate. The other thing that it did was that it, for the first time, introduced an idea that sexuality was fluid. For example, that having appreciation for the physical form of somebody who was the same sex as you, or even having fantasies of someone who was the same sex as you, was much more common than what people had previously thought. That people are not just solely homosexual or solely heterosexual, but that it was more sexual fluidity. We'll also see in that same year, Playboy magazine is going to be produced for the very first time. Hugh Hefner died just shortly a bit ago, back in September of 2017. But in 1957, he introduced the very first Playboy magazine, and it had Marilyn Monroe as its centerfold. Now, this picture was actually kind of controversial, not just because she was naked, but also the fact that she didn't give him the rights to do this, that rather it had been a modeling photograph that had been taken that was supposed to be artistic back when she was very, very young, before she actually became Marilyn Monroe, and she was still known as Norma Jean. And this was then sold to Playboy, and it was published. And she was really upset about it because she felt it was an invasion of her privacy. However, it made Playboy instantaneously popular because she was such a sex symbol. And so Hugh Hefner and the Playboy brand became extremely popular, and they ended up opening their own gentlemen's clubs in the late 1950s that would be popular all the way up through the 1980s, when the last of those would close. There is a new one that has been reopened. I believe it's in Vegas. But the whole idea of the Playboy Club was that each of the girls that was there was dressed as one of these Playboy bunnies, and it was supposed to be kind of a men's playground. And there was a lot of wealthy and powerful men that would go there to kind of live out some of their fantasies of these gorgeous young women who would, be there at their beck and call. In a few lessons, we're going to get to actually the feminist movement, and part of the feminist movement begins with a young woman who goes undercover at one of these Playboy clubs, and that's going to be Gloria Steinem, and we'll talk more about her in a future lesson. Now, the final part of this beginning and budding sexual revolution is going to be the introduction of the pill, rather the birth control pill. Now, the reason that it is called the pill is because it was so revolutionary that women would have their own ability to avoid or prevent pregnancy. This was something that women had never had control over before. Yes, contraception had existed. Condoms have been around since ancient Greece. However, the fact that women could control it themselves was really revolutionary. And this was highly controversial. Now, it was promoted as saying, hey, this is for health. This is so that women are not having pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy and leading to higher infant or mother mortality rates. That this was going to make sure that babies that were born out of choice, not out of chance. And it was also hopefully going to help control the overwhelming population increase with that baby boom. However, like I said, it's highly controversial. There was a lot of stigma around it. The fact that women would actually have a choice as to whether they were going to have children or not was seen as playing God. That women having birth control was seen as them admitting that they enjoyed sex and that they could, have a sexual life that wasn't just for the procreation of children. Now, the older woman that you see photographed there, you might be wondering, like, why is there an old lady on this? That is Margaret Sanger, and if you recall from the 1920s, she was the person that created the Birth Control League, which was the precursor to Planned Parenthood. And she actually put forth a lot of her own money to ensure that the pill ended up being produced, because the FDA didn't even want to test it because it was such a taboo idea. So she had to put a lot of her own money and a lot of her kind of her celebrity, people knowing who she was, towards getting the government to even research the pill and get it produced, because it was such a taboo idea. So she comes up yet again. Now, probably the most out there group to come out of this rebellion against conformity is going to be known as the Beat Generation. You probably better know them as a beatnik. However, the term beatnik was utilized by people in the news and people in the media that were trying to discount this group, calling, kind of making a stereotype of them in the media as being kind of out there and possibly even dangerous. And the reason they used the name Beatnik was that it sounded like Sputnik, as in like they're from another like world, they're from outer space, they don't make sense here, they're not from here, they're alien. And that's where the term beatnik comes from. So you'll hear me mostly refer to them as the Beats or the Beat Generation. So the Beat Generation was a group of underground and anti-conformist youth that they settled mainly in Greenwich Village, New York, which is where the bohemians of the 1920s had settled. And they were very artistic. They were experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Mainly it was marijuana that they were experimenting in. They were also open to alternative forms of sexuality, that homosexuality and bisexuality were accepted by these groups. And it was not seen as something that was other, but rather an exploration of the fluidity of sexuality. They also had a really keen interest in Eastern religions, so Buddhism is going to kind of come into vogue with this group, as well as that they are rejecting of consumerism. They reject conformity. They reject the mainstream America. Basically, they're the original hipsters. And they felt that artistic expression was the way to achieve truth. So kind of almost similar to the lost generation that we saw in the 1920s following World War I. And the two most popular, well-known beats from this era is going to be Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Allen Ginsberg wrote an epic poem titled Howl that describes the Beat Generation, and it describes their ideals and where they're coming from. Many of these beats were actually coming from middle-class families. They were coming from families where they were expected to, to graduate from high school, go to college, and join, dad's firm kind of thing. And they were rejecting that. They wanted to come up with their own personal feeling of their purpose in life. And you see a lot of that in Howl. And so here's kind of the very first part of it. Ginsberg says, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollowed eye and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz." If you've ever seen a movie or a television show where they've got the people standing up on stage, dressed all in black and playing a bongo and kind of reciting poetry in a weird kind of stop fashion, that's kind of a play on the beats. Now, Jack Kerouac was the most well-known as far as being a novelist, and his book On the Road really shows how a lot of them were lost emotionally, as well as, trying to find what they believed as truth in their path. The book On the Road is somewhat autobiographical from what Jack Kerouac himself experienced. And here's a short excerpt from there. He said, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, 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 like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle, you see the blue center light pop, and everyone goes, ah. That just gives you an idea of kind of who he was and what he was trying to identify is people who are not just doing this conformist thing because that's what you were expected to do, but rather doing these things because that's what you wanted to do. And now we get to the rebels that you're probably the most familiar with, and that is the teenage rebel. Many times they were referred to as juvenile delinquents, also sometimes shortened to JDs. They were also referred to as greasers, and that was because of two things. One, because they wore a lot of product in their hair that kind of made it look greasy to get that little, little curl up in the front and the, slicked back sides, but also because a lot of them worked on cars, and so they would constantly be covered in car grease, and so that's where they get the nickname of greasers. Now, greasers, or these teenage rebels, juvenile delinquents, were rebelling against authority, and a lot of them against the middle-class life that they had been raised with. Very similar to the Beats, where they were saying, but I don't want to go to college and go to work at dad's firm. I want to do what is fun for me and what I want to do. The kind of big difference between them and the Beats is that the Beats were a little bit more artistic with their rebellion, whereas these teenage rebels were either apathetic or sometimes actually even going to the extent of some form of violence, because they did form their own little gangs, fighting for territory within their own neighborhoods as to who got to hang out in what place. They listened to rock and roll. They experimented with drugs and alcohol. They rebelled against authority. They were definitely a lot more promiscuous than their peers. So you would see these teenage rebels, quote unquote, necking at the drive-in theaters, finding their way to the back seat of their big cars. We see a lot of this also being introduced through literature, and probably the most prominent book to illustrate these teenage rebels at the time was the book The Catcher in the Rye. If you have never read this book, I highly recommend it. J.D. Salinger writes this book about a boy by the name of Holden Caulfield, who has been kicked out of his umpteenth private school. His parents have worked really hard for him to be there, and he just can't seem to conform because he doesn't like it. He feels it's, in his favorite word, phony. And so he leaves school and kind of goes to find himself, and he ends up getting into a lot of trouble. He ends up hanging out with a prostitute and drinking and doing drugs, and he eventually feels that none of that's making him happy either, and he tries to go home. The book was immediately banned across the United States. Cities and states and school districts banned this book because not only was he doing things that did not follow kind of those traditional rules of conformity and following the rules of authority like we're expecting young people to do, but also that he used a lot of, at that time, considered to be foul language. His favorite word was goddamn. In this book, it says it a whole lot, and that was enough to get it banned in a lot of places. The other place that we're going to see this image of the teenage rebel is going to be in movies, specifically in a movie called Rebel Without a Cause, and then the one at the bottom with Marlon Brando being very, very young is going to be a movie called The Wild One. And in these movies, we see that, these rebels living large, living fast, being, anti-authority and that type of thing. However, the major issue with it is that in almost all of these movies, the rebel ends up either dying in some really awful, tragic way, or it is that they are reformed and conformed by a good-hearted girl. And these were almost like cautionary tales for young people. However, young people didn't really focus on the if I'm a bad guy, I'm gonna, die in a fiery car crash because I decided to play chicken. But rather that they're gonna see this and gonna be like, oh man, he's cool. I want to look like him. I want to act like him. And it actually inspired a lot more kids than it deterred them. So why was rock and roll so dangerous? It's because it wasn't like their parents' music. For the first time really ever, teenagers were listening to music that was drastically different than what their parents' generation had listened to, and it was not popular amongst an adult crowd. Now, the very first considered to be rock and roll song was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. A lot of you guys are familiar with this song. You've probably heard it somewhere before. Now, the song Rock Around the Clock is considered to be the first rock and roll song. However, it's very closely tied to a type of music that bridged into the creation of rock and roll, and that was called rockabilly. Rock and roll was born out of traditional black rhythm and blues and white country music. So when you took those two types of music, you got rockabilly. It was hillbilly music with a rocking beat. And so Rock Around the Clock was the first to kind of go just one step further than this. And part of what made that possible was a brand new invention, the electric guitar. And so with the electric guitar, we are now able to create a new sound that is distinctly different and has definitely the evidence of being kind of black origin. And originating from the black community, the problem was that made it not popular amongst a white crowd. In fact, it was dubbed as race music by the media and especially by music stations. And so a lot of them wouldn't even play it. So phenomenal performers like you see here, Chuck Berry, a lot of people just didn't hear his music until it was covered by quote unquote acceptable white artists. So you see two artists here who had their music covered by a white artist. So the woman at the top, her name is Big Mama Thornton, and Big Mama Thornton was known for singing this rhythm and blues song, and then it would be redone by a white artist, and the song was Hound Dog. And the original lyrics to Hound Dog are, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog been creeping round my door. You ain't nothing but a hound dog and I ain't gonna feed you no more." So it was really about kind of a bad boyfriend that was trying to come back and get back into her life, and she shuts him out. And then if you listen to the version that you're probably more familiar with, the Elvis Presley version, it's a lot less sexual, and there's somehow a rabbit involved, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's a fun song, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. The one at the bottom, that's Fats Domino. And he was a phenomenal piano player, and his song Blueberry Hill was incredibly popular. However, because he was black, his music was not heard on the radio. And so one of those bubblegum artists that I talked about earlier, Pat Boone, ended up actually making a cover of that song. And I recommend that you guys listen to these because they are really phenomenal versions of songs you already know. And in my personal opinion, I think they're much better than the white cover versions, especially when you look at the one by Pat Boone. That one will just put anybody to sleep. So if you need help sleeping, just listen to Pat Boone's version of Blueberry Hill and you'll immediately. Now, the man who made it popular for people to listen to rock and roll, there's going to be two major ones. The first of these is the guy here, and that is Alan Freed. Alan Freed was a DJ from Cleveland, and he is going to popularize the genre among white audiences. First of all, by no longer calling it race music, or Negro R&B, as sometimes it was referred to as well. In fact, he gives it a new name called rock and roll. Now, the thing about rock and roll, though, is that was actually a term that was utilized by the black community already to describe a certain nighttime adult activity, which I will let you figure out on your own. But the thing is that this new term made it already more acceptable because it wasn't quote-unquote race music. And so he's going to introduce the music, the real artist. He's going to play Chuck Berry. He's going to play Fats Domino. He's going to play the actual artist, not the white cover artists. Unfortunately, however, he is going to end up getting caught up into a scandal known as payola. his career ends because it was shown that he had accepted what is called payola, which are payments from record companies to play specific records to make it seem like that particular song was more popular than it was. So it would kind of be like if, suddenly, I don't know, the nationwide insurance jingle became the suddenly #1 hit single on Billboard's top charts. That would be weird because people aren't listening to the nationwide insurance jingle just for funsies. And so it would kind of artificially inflate these. The other man that is responsible for introducing rock and roll to America is this guy, Sam Phillips, and his recording studio, Sun Studios. Sun Studios was just a recording studio. Anyone could go in there, record music, and then he would make the record and you would, get to leave. Well, all these people start coming in, and this is in Memphis. There's all these people coming in, and they're all making these, song demos and spoken word and birthday greetings and things like this. And there were these people coming in that were really good, and they couldn't find a record company. And he's like, shoot, I've already got all the equipment. Why don't I actually start being the producer for this? And so he is going to be the producer for some of the biggest artists of the time through Sun Records. And those people are going to be people like Jerry Lee Lewis, who is known for Great Balls of Fire. On the top right, that's Roy Orbison, known for Pretty Woman. On the bottom, that is going to be Johnny Cash, known for a whole bunch of music, including Walk the Line. And then one day, his secretary records a young man who wanted to sing a gospel hymn for his mother's birthday. And she was so impressed by this young man that she makes a secret separate copy and she gives it to Sam Phillips. And she says, you really need to listen to this. He hadn't been in the studio that day. And he listens to it and he's like, gospel doesn't sell, so I'm not going to sign this person. And besides, it's another black artist whose music isn't going to go anywhere. And she says, yeah, he's not black. He's white. And he's like, no way. There's no way that a white artist can sound like this. There's no way that they can have that much soul. And when that happened, Phillips actually decides to sign the young man, and it became his greatest artist, and that was none other than Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Elvis Presley is considered the king of rock and roll because he was the person that made rock and roll available to the mass audience. While he was a white artist that many times did cover black music, he was the first one that actually made it sound like it should and not one of those really sappy, bubbly cover versions like we heard from people like Pat Boone. And so it was introducing the music to a wider audience than ever before. Girls absolutely obsessed over him in a way that America had never seen before. Girls were hysterical just at the mention of his name. Fan clubs sprung up across the United States that young teenage boys started growing their sideburns long and slicking their hair back to look just like Elvis. However, parents were really concerned because he was considered far too sexual for many audiences, that the swinging of his hips and kind of the snarling of his lip was considered far too sexual, and people were very concerned about this. However, with his extremely long career, Elvis Presley kind of solidified himself as the king of rock and roll and would have that title for the remainder of all time. However, this era of music is going to disappear. This era of kind of this fun, bubbly, poppy style of rock and roll. The man you see in kind of the background picture here, that's Buddy Holly. And then the man at the top right, that is a performer known as the Big Bopper, and then below that is Ritchie Valens. And these three were on a nationwide tour where they were performing in small audiences or small venues across the United States. Unfortunately, Buddy Holly, known for Peggy Sue and Oh Boy, the Big Bopper, known for the song Chantilly Lace, and Ritchie Valens, known for the songs Donna and La Bamba, all died in a plane crash on February 3rd, 1959. And when this crashed, it was really the loss of innocence for the early rock and roll generation. That this was going to later on be dubbed as the day the music died. And it would inspire Don McLean to write the song American Pie about these three. And what was really unfortunate about this, aside from the deaths of these young, well-known performers, was that that era of music was gone, and there was really not much to replace it, at least initially. Because although there was a new style of music, there was a bit of a struggle to make it into its popularity, and that music would be Motown. Motown was a African-American record label, and it was by African-Americans, and it was with African-American style music that was a combination of rock and roll and doo-wop music, kind of like if you took doo-wop, R&B, and rock and roll and put them together. It was called that because Motown is the nickname for Detroit, where it was born through. Motown stands for Motortown or Motor City. It was founded by Berry Gordy, who you see here, and it was known for its kind of signature style of this soul music that had this very distinct pop influence. Had really famous artists that we know today, like who we see in the background, which is the Temptations, the man photographed in the middle, which is Smokey Robinson. We also had Stevie Wonder, and at the bottom there we have Diana Ross and the Supremes. Their music would be popular throughout the 1960s and would grow in popularity as time would go on, and would eventually develop into new styles of music, including funk, hip-hop, and then later on rap. However, Motown music was really important as kind of this placeholder while rock and roll was trying to figure out what it was going to do now that its original popular artists were now gone. So now we move into the Cold War pop culture and what America was doing for fun at the time. And our first topic is going to be art. Now, what you're looking at right here is one of the most popular pieces of art at the time. And if you're looking at it and you're going, well, my 4-year-old little cousin could do that. Well, some people think so. Other people see this and they see this as a really intricate form of art where color tells us the story. And this set of drips and dribbles, as many people would refer to it, was done by Jackson Pollock. And his art was a new style of abstract art where there wasn't any one singular form of thing that we are painting. We're not painting people. We're not painting items. We're painting ideas and emotions, and those can't be formulated into a physical object. The other style of art that is very iconic from the 1950s and early 1960s is dot art that was done by an artist known as Lichtenstein. And you see this a lot in comic books and in cartoons from the time, this style of dot art. Very, very popular style. We also are going to see, kind of almost artistic, that we're going to have this obsession with atomic design. Anything that looks like it's space agey. Anything that has to do with science and atoms and anything like that. So we see the giant fins on the cars and the bullet-shaped taillights to make it look like a rocket, that there are all kinds of science fiction movies and books and television at this time, including the introduction of the Jetsons, which, fun fact, the Jetsons was actually supposed to be set in the year 2000. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm still waiting on my robot maid. And we get to television, probably the most important piece of popular culture at this time. For the very first time in history, the majority of Americans had access to a television, had at least one in their home. We would probably start to hit multi-television homes by the late 1960s, early 1970s. So for the most part at this time, it's just one television within the home. However, television was a really important part of our culture and who we were and how we behaved. And most of the television shows made a very clear effort to celebrate traditional American values. So, for example, we see in the background here the popularity of the Superman television show, which if you play it, you can see the introduction of it. And he ends it with, and protecting truth, justice, and the American way. And so it was, promoting these American traditional values and ideals. Television is going to further homogenize American cultural and speech patterns even more than the radio had. So we're going to see the reduction of American regional dialects. And oddly enough, we become so obsessed with our televisions, kind of like we were with our cars, that we don't want to miss a single moment. And so we are going to see the beginning of something called the TV dinner. And ladies, let me tell you, this was a giant saver for you. This was a lifesaver because all you had to do is you just take out this little meal, you put it in the oven for 45 minutes, and then you're done. And you guys and the family, you can sit in front of the television and all watch TV while eating your TV dinners. And that way you don't have to spend hours cooking every single meal. Women loved this. So the television of this time was very family friendly. The sitcoms were always about these wonderful families with 2 to 3 children, married parents, and the daily struggles of life. So the ones that you see at the top, this is the cast from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which had originally been a radio program and now was its own television program. However, what was really unique about it is that Ozzie and Harriet and the 2 boys in the show were actually a real live family. They're the Nelson family. And people felt it was like getting a glimpse into their own lives, even though it was definitely a made-up show and totally scripted. Then we have the show that's beneath it, probably the most famous family from the 1950s, and that is the Cleaver family from Leave It to Beaver. And kind of, oh my goodness, the things that the Beav gets into, and, he broke somebody's window with his baseball and now has to, learn about responsibility and that type of thing. The other really popular show, and the most popular show of the 1950s, was the Ed Sullivan Show. This was a variety show. And it was wildly popular for especially introducing new musical artists, as well as new comedians and new performers. And probably one of the top shows that he had during the 1950s was when Elvis Presley was first introduced on his show. 82% of TV viewers watched Elvis Presley's first appearance on the show. However, Ed Sullivan was not thrilled with Elvis's performance solely because of the shaking and the swiveling of his hips was a little too sexualized for his family-friendly show. And so shortly thereafterwards, he said that if he ever came back on the show, that Elvis would have to only be filmed from the waist up so that it was not deemed inappropriate for his home audiences. Now, I know this is not going to seem connected, but trust me, I'll get there. During the 1950s, we see a post-war religious revival, and we typically have religious revivals after any major social upheaval. And during the 1950s, church membership does nearly double. That we are going to see the focus on tradition and conformity, as well as showing that we are different from the godless communists. There is no religion under true communism. And so we wanted to show we were different. So, for example, the words under God are going to be added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the words in God we trust will be added to our money. But here's how it relates to TV. For the first time ever, we actually have church on television, and we are going to have the introduction of televangelists, especially those like the Reverend Billy Graham, who becomes the most well-known televangelist. Billy Graham died just recently on February 21st, 2018, but he, along with these other television preachers, so the tele-evangelist, spreading the word, they denounced communism, they promoted patriotism just as much as they promoted their religious messages. And they really tried to show that if America was going to defeat the communists, that they had to get themselves back to church. One final thing about television is that there was, for the first time, going to be shows specifically for teenagers, and the most well-known of these is American Bandstand. This was a music and dance show for teens, which was hosted by Dick Clark, who you see up at the top right there. And this is where young people would learn the new hit songs and the new styles and new dances. That the kids that were on the show were regular kids and could actually earn themselves a spot on the show as a quote-unquote regular, being brought back, year after year or day after day. And this is, where kids would learn the hot new dances, and the regulars on the show actually invented a lot of new dances, including dances like the stroll, the monkey, the swim, etc. Excuse me. This show, if it seems like really familiar to you and you're like, wait a minute, like I feel like I know this. If you've ever seen the movie Hairspray, this is what that show was loosely based on. And yes, just like on in the movie Hairspray, it was still segregated, and that there wasn't any people that were African American on the show, unless occasionally, as the years went on, they were brought in as a musical performer. However, no black teenagers were brought in to be dancers until much, much later. However, Bandstand would last on the air all the way up until the 1980s. And then we get to my favorite place, the happiest place on earth, and that's Disneyland. Disneyland opened on July 17th, 1955, and this was opened by Walt Disney because he felt that there really weren't a lot of options for families to go and enjoy together. He had taken his kids to the amusement parks that were kind of nearby them, and the county fairs, and they were dirty, they were not kept well as there weren't a lot of really good rides for young children. And so he wanted someplace where the entire family could go and enjoy. Now, when it very first opened, Disneyland was free for entrance. That's right, you could walk in the gates for free. But just like a county fair, to go on any of the rides, you had to buy tickets. And so each of the tickets cost a different amount, and it depended on how kind of good or popular the ride was. So for example, riding on the double-decker bus down Main Street, that was an A ticket ride. A B ticket ride might be going on the train or going to see Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. And then you had a C, D, and then the top ticket, the E ticket. And the E ticket was for all the big, really cool, crazy fun rides. Ones like the Matterhorn and the Teacups were all the E ticket rides. Shortly thereafterwards was the introduction of the Mickey Mouse Club, only a few months later on October 3rd, 1955. And when the Mickey Mouse Club was first introduced, it was almost immediately popular because they were regular kids. They weren't actors or anything like that. It was a really popular thing, and it had, specialized Mickey cartoons that you didn't see anywhere else, as well as they had a different theme every single day. The Mickey Mouse Club would run all the way up until the late 1960s, early 1970s, and then it would come back on the air in the 1990s, run for about 10 years, and then it just came back on the air just recently. However, if you look at the three versions, they are very distinctly and uniquely to each of their own decades, and not very much like each other. As far as literature goes, the 1950s were kind of an interesting time. First of all, we have the introduction of Mad Magazine. This is definitely kind of going against the grain. Mad Magazine was satire and critique of 1950s society. So it was also a little bit off color in its jokes, and so it was not considered to be of the highest quality for the good conservative American. We also are going to see that a lot of the books from this era are going to be kind of dystopian, kind of a contrast to the conformity and the quote-unquote affluence of the 1950s. So for example, we see the books Lord of the Flies and Fahrenheit 451, two books that are very dystopian and looking at the dark side of humanity. And then we see something that kind of goes along with our fascination of all things science fiction of the time, and that was the publication of the first book by Isaac Asimov known as I, Robot. And if you're like, wait, I know that name, there was a movie made about it with Will Smith a little while ago. And the book I, Robot was actually the very first time that the word robot was introduced to the American public. And it was an idea that that we could potentially make these man-like humans. However, if we do it the wrong way, that they could end up being our demise. And then finally, let's get back to comic books. Back in the 1940s, people like Captain America and Superman and Batman were all fighting Hitler. Well, now they've got a different enemy. Now they're fighting the commies. However, there was a brand new thing in the 1950s to ensure that these were not teaching young children bad values. And so there was a new organization called the Comics Code Authority. And the Comics Code Authority was a voluntary group that comic books would join to ensure that what the content of their comics was about was not dangerous or was not something that was going to be harmful to America's virtue. So some of these things were, some of the rules were, crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust in the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Another one. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Or another one. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. And then some of my other favorites are nudity in any form is prohibited, as is indecent or undue exposure. Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. So obviously it was trying to ensure that these were highly moral because they were mainly going to be consumed by a young audience. And as for the fads of the 1950s, oh, there were so many. Hula hoops were a brand new thing in the 1950s, and it was partially because of a fascination with Hawaii as well as a desire for inexpensive and durable toys. So there was a huge hula hoop fad among kids, as well as a fascination with yo-yos, that there were entire yo-yo competitions as to who could do the coolest tricks. That we had the fad of the 3D movie. However, almost immediately it became popular, like way too popular, and then it dropped off in its popularity. So within a few years, the only ones that that were really being made is these 3D movies were what we would call the B movies, kind of the, you know, straight to Netflix kind of movies, the ones that don't really make it in the movie theater. These would be really bad monster movies and stuff like that. And then we also saw another toy, the Slinky. The Slinky was invented just at the tail end of World War II, kind of as an accident. A man who was working in an industrial factory put down a metal spring and it rolled off of the counter in kind of a fun, interesting way. Brought it home to his son. His son so loved playing with it and having it walk down the stairs that the dad got an idea and decided to start making them as a toy, and it had the exact same price for nearly 40 years as a relatively inexpensive toy that was extremely durable. On the bottom left, yes, this was a fad, and this was a fad amongst teenagers and young people, and that was phone booth stuffing or car stuffing. Trying to see how many people you could shove into a phone booth or shove into a small car like a VW Beetle. And the record of 25 people being stuffed into a phone booth was set in South Africa in 1959, which is terrifying that this is what people were doing. But hey, you guys were swallowing Tide Pods, so I guess we can't make fun. The other one that we have at the bottom is going to be Davy Crockett. Disney started coming out with these kind of mini-series movies that they would show on a weekly basis, and Davy Crockett was probably the most popular one. It was not only celebrating an American folk hero, a strong man, a frontiersman who went on to become a congressman and defended America's rights out at the Alamo, but also that it was, showing true patriotism. And so it was something that would kind of reiterate American values. And so you would see a lot of young boys throughout the 1950s wearing those coonskin caps, despite the fact that Davy Crockett never wore a coonskin cap. But it has become synonymous with him because of the TV movie. And to give you an idea as to how popular this miniseries was, the theme song from this miniseries about Davy Crockett, the one you might have heard of, born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free. That song actually bumped Elvis out of the #1 spot on the Billboard chart. So if that gives you an idea as to just how popular this show was, it was really quite influential at its time. And our final little section, we get into the Kennedy years. So most of what we've been looking at was through the 50s, maybe into the very early 1960s. So we have a real quick thing about Kennedy, and at the bottom here we have linked a video of Kennedy's most popular television campaign ad. And very similar to Dwight Eisenhower, really used the television as a way to get people to know him and to get people to vote for him. Just as catchy as Dwight Eisenhower's as well. But what really makes this interesting in the election of 1960 is a major shift in a lot of firsts in this election. First of all, this is going to be with Richard Nixon, the vice president, running for the role of president. Very rarely happened up to this point. Had only happened only once or twice, basically when a previous president had died and then the vice president took over, as with like Harry Truman. So this is really the first time that a vice president is going to run on his own steam without the previous president dying. Nixon is experienced. He's known as a strong anti-communist. However, there's a lot of scandal surrounding him. Then you have Kennedy. He's young, he's youthful, but he doesn't have a lot of experience. And the biggest concern for a lot of people, he's Catholic. And as much as people wouldn't even bat an eyelash at that today, it was a really big deal for people in 1960, and they were very concerned about this. But the other major first is that this is the very first televised presidential debate. And if you had listened to it on the radio, a lot of people said that Nixon won hands down. But the people watching it on television had a different story. And that had a lot to do with the way that it was filmed. Kennedy was coming back from campaigning in California, so he was fresh-faced, he was well-rested, he was tan. He wore a dark suit that contrasted very well with the gray background that was behind the debate podium. However, Nixon had just gotten over the flu, was thin, and so his suit didn't fit him very well because he had lost a lot of weight. He had a back injury, and so he was shifting around a lot, which made him look uncomfortable. And he also didn't wear any makeup, which made him sweat a lot under the lights, which made him look like he didn't know what he was talking about, or even that he was guilty. And so these things very much shifted the favor in Kennedy's direction. And so Kennedy is elected, and he's going to introduce the new frontier. And I recommend that you watch the video here as he introduces this in his inaugural address. However, in this inaugural address, he also says some of the most famous words. He says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Ask not what America can do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man." And this was a really big statement to take, because it was not only introducing this idea that we as a nation must band together to protect each other, but it was also introducing ideas that were previously not very popular under the previous president. For example, he was recommending that there be regular public service, that everybody be involved in public service, not just people who were elected into government, but everybody should do something for their community. He was looking to eradicate poverty. He wanted to conserve for the environment. He wanted better cooperation with Latin America. He wanted to put emphasis on manned space exploration, and he would also put some emphasis on civil rights. And so as Kennedy takes over, we're going to be hearing a term to describe it a lot, and that is Camelot. Now, Camelot describes the era of King Arthur from Great Britain. And there was a famous play that came out in 1960, a great musical about the era of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot. And the beauty and the glamour and the excitement about it was kind of equated to JFK and his family. His wife was young and she was extremely fashionable. He had two very young children that were in the White House that were constantly the favorite of the press as to what, little, mishaps or shenanigans that they had gotten into. And just their youth and their vitality made the American public really excited to see them. It was the first time that we had had young children in the White House since Theodore Roosevelt. So it really gave America hope for the future because they knew that Kennedy would do everything he could to ensure a brighter future for his children. Another thing that he does is he creates an organization for looking at the status of women in America. And the woman that he puts in place as its chair is going to be none other than our school's namesake, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt really gets this position because she had promised him that she would give him her endorsement, kind of as the most well-known Democrat in America at the time and the most well-respected, as long as he made a point to look into the problems facing women of the time. And so that's why he creates this organization. He also creates the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was an organization where young people, especially those that are kind of college age, would go to third world countries, teach them about American values, teach them basic economic things that'll make their lives better, health things that'll make their lives better. And then in return, it would also help these people in these countries know that Americans are not scary, that we are people that they should like, as well as that ours is a country that is better than communism. And he's also, like I said, going to encourage the Apollo program, which we looked at in a previous class. And although he would not live to see us land on the moon, the emphasis that he put on space travel would get us into space within only a couple of years, and then we would then be well on our way into making it to the moon. However, unfortunately, like I said, JFK would not live to November 22nd, 1963, JFK was in Dallas, Texas with his wife as they were campaigning for his re-election. A man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed JFK while riding in his open car, the open convertible, as they went down the street. His wife immediately jumps over him and they speed off towards the hospital. Lee Harvey Oswald was then arrested after fleeing his position from the Texas School Book Depository, and he would be shot and killed 2 days later by a businessman by the name of Jack Ruby. Now, the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a lot of controversy around this, and that there are a lot of conspiracy theories about why was Kennedy shot, why did Oswald shoot him, and why Jack Ruby, a man who had connections with the mob, might have been involved in the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. Why was Lee Harvey Oswald being transported in public rather than, being under greater armed guard? And as far as Kennedy's actual assassination, there has been a lot of controversy as to maybe there was more than one shooter. And we rely on one video in particular for this, and that is the Zapruder film. A man by the name of Abraham Zapruder unexpectedly captured the assassination by filming it with a home movie camera, the one you see right here. And it is the only complete film of the event. It's the only complete film of JFK's assassination. And so it has been analyzed down to its nth degree. You can watch it here if you would like to, though I do want to warn you that it is very graphic content. However, with the glory that is computer animation and computer analytics, we've actually been able to recreate it frame by frame and to show that this was done by a single shooter, which was Lee Harvey Oswald, which you can see linked in the image right here. And so with the president gone, the vice president now has to take the oath of office. And so Johnson took the oath of office upon Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy standing right beside him as soon as they had boarded JFK's body onto the plane so that it could be brought back to Washington to lay in state. You can see in the picture here, she's still wearing the pink Chanel suit that she was wearing when he had been assassinated. And immediately following this, when they got back to Washington, Johnson ordered there be an investigative commission created specifically to investigate the assassination. There's a lot of information that was kind of missing or left out simply because they felt it was too classified. And so it's still controversial, and there are inconsistencies and oversights within it, which is why there are so many conspiracy theorists that are obsessed with the JFK assassination. However, it was an incredibly important one because it showed that, that the president is really not safe, and that that we were now in an era where the president's movements were going to be watched very closely by people who were against him and might lead to an assassination attempt. JFK's funeral was one of the largest watched events in American television in the early 1960s, bringing millions of people to watch the event live on television. One of the most iconic images to come from this was when the president's body was brought forth and was being brought to lay to rest, and his young son, John Kennedy Jr., or John as he was referred to, goes ahead and he salutes the casket as it goes by. JFK's body was interred at Arlington National Cemetery, and there is an eternal flame there to show the light that he had inspired. And this really was the end of an era of innocence and hope. From this point forward under Johnson, that America would become further mired in racial unrest with the rise of the civil rights movement, as well as a military quagmire in Vietnam. And although I know this is kind of a down moment for this to end, it does show us where people were entering into the mid-1960s. So we're going to move on from here and start talking about the civil rights movement. And I hope you guys got through this in not too scathed.